Hello early friends, today I have a bit of a special video for you. I recently got a question regarding the idea of the passage of time in writing and the idea of transitions, like showing your reader that time is passing in between chapters, and I have a few tips for that. Some of them are more narrative based and some of them are more meta based, but before I go anywhere, as always, allow me to give you the formal disclaimer and remind you that the following is merely just my advice, my opinion, and what works for me. Don't take it as gospel, instead take it as the ramblings of a silly person that looks a little bit like this. And also the ramblings of a person who feels like their shirt is like, the buttons are too spaced out, you know what I mean? It's like, sometimes I feel like I want to button up the top button of my shirt, but then I feel like now I look like a serial killer, you know what I'm saying? You gotta like unbutton, you know? There's like levels to buttoning. With all of that silliness out of the way, let's dive right in. Today's subject is about the idea of transitions and the passage of time in writing. We're talking about the idea of time passing, whether it is a little bit or a long time, passing in between chapters or scenes. And as I've mentioned, I recently got a question about that, and I totally understand why somebody would feel doubts regarding something like that, because as I've mentioned, in writing a story, the easiest way to turn your reader off is by confusing them. And if you have a huge, a span of time passing between chapters or scenes, you have to be clear about that, otherwise the reader will be entirely confused. And that is something to worry about, but I think that they are pretty interesting, some easy, some not so easy, ways to make this very clear to your reader. Now, as I mentioned, I think there are two different types of ways you can go about doing things. And by that I mean showing your reader, to make it clear to your reader, that time is indeed passing between scenes or chapters. One is what I like to call the meta way to go about doing things. What do I mean by meta? By meta, I mean the things that have nothing to do with the story that can still show your reader that time is passing. I'm talking about formatting things. I'm talking about the elements of the book other than the story, such as titles and dates. It's funny because I feel that people underappreciate these meta ways of explaining the transition in time, but they're really the most straightforward and even blunt ways of telling your reader, hey, time has just passed. So what sort of examples am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about things like beginning every chapter with the date and the time. That's a really clear way to tell your reader at the start of every chapter, hey, you know what? It's this date and this time. And it even gives them a little bit of an idea for what sort of setting they're taking place. But I know that some people don't like that, but those sort of super meta date/time sort of formats work really well for detective stories or murder mysteries, where the time and the place really do matter. That being said, not every story has a need for a time and a place right at the beginning of every chapter. But another thing that could be very helpful is the chapter title. If the chapters in your story happen to have names, you can definitely use those as a way to portray the passage of time. It can be as anything as for the following Christmas to actually using the month, like July 2015. Again, as I mentioned, these meta ways of showing your reader the passage of time, if you go from chapter August 1995 to September 1995, the reader pretty much understands, okay, a month has passed since the last chapter, and since all of the events that happened in the last chapter. The goal of storytelling is to portray a story to the reader, and you want to be really clear. You want to make things as clear as possible so there's no ambiguity, unless you want there to be ambiguity, which is entirely okay. But if you're moving from one point in time to another, and you want the reader, you almost need the reader to be entirely clear on the passage of time. And I think that these meta ways of explaining it are the most straightforward and blunt ways of saying, hey, reader, lovely reader, we're now in a different time and place altogether. I think they're really effective and almost blunt to a fault, but then again, you can't argue with their results. If the reader is entirely aware and fully understanding of the passage of time in between chapters, then, it works. If it works, it works, right? That being said, though, as I've mentioned, I think there are two ways to do things. Either the meta way, by using the actual formatting in the book to let the reader know, and then I'm the more narrative way. Because giving your chapters titles and using the date format at the beginning of every chapter is good. It's effective, but it may not be for every story. Every story is different, and for some stories, as I mentioned, a detective story or a murder mystery, having the time and place, or just the time and the date, at the beginning of every chapter is effective, and it's good because it builds to the narrative. Not in most stories, though. Now, what I do think works with every story is the narrative transition. It is kind of the classic standard, it's the idea of beginning the following chapter, or, at the next point in the transition, with a little bit of an explanation. Maybe not exactly a person telling you, hey, now it's winter, last chapter was autumn. Not really like that, but more like showing us that time has indeed changed. It can be as simple as showing the change of the seasons, like showing the snow on the streets and people getting ready for the holidays, to actually showing the character's age and time passing. Like if you had a character who was pregnant in the previous chapter and you have just jumped like months in the future, you can just have them with their baby. That's a pretty easy and straightforward way to say, hey, reader, dear reader, lovely reader, time has now passed. We're in a different point altogether. I know that the narrative way to show a transition is a lot less clear, or a lot less to the point than the meta way. I mean, it's really hard to be more straightforward than saying, Chapter 11, Winter. But, I mean, you have to balance things out. You can be super blunt, or you can be a little bit more narrative about it. And there are so many ways to show your reader, and note the keyword, show your reader, through the changes in the weather around us, because, I mean, after all, that is the way that we measure time. It can be things like the first snow, the turning of the leaves, the heat of summer, and the rains of spring. Now, before we go anywhere, I need to talk about something right this very moment, okay? There's an idea out there, one of those really old writing rules that I always get thrown at. And this rule is one of those rules that I always have thrown at me whenever I mention this particular point about transitions. And I want to tackle it right now, because people always say, don't start a chapter with weather. Now, I have a problem with stuff like that. I have a problem with rules that tell you what not to do. Have you ever noticed that there's so many more rules telling you what not to do as opposed to rules telling you what to do? It's actually a little overwhelming, and when I first began my blog and my channel, I began because I wanted to give another point of view, because there were so many people and blogs and channels telling you, don't do all of these things. Then I realized that I myself as a writer felt, so what am I supposed to do then if I have all these enormous list of things telling me what not to do? Because people say, don't start a chapter with weather. Don't start a chapter with dialogue. Don't start a chapter with characters talking. Don't start a chapter with description. Don't start with narration. And I'm sitting there, like younger Max going, so don't start chapters then. Just don't write. Because there are all these, like, boulders upon boulders of negativity. And over time, I just started letting go of all those things. Start your story with weather. Start your story with whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, writing is a medium without rules. And I've been saying this for years. I'm not selling my advice as hard rules. Do this or you will fail. I'm just giving you my advice. This is what I believe, what has worked for me in the past, and nothing else. I don't sell these videos and my opinion as anything else other than that. My opinion. And bringing it back, I know that some people won't like hearing that, and that's okay. We're all different people in the same medium. That's entirely fine. My thing is this, okay? In this particular subject, we're talking about the idea of passing from time to time. Jumping from a point in time to another one in between chapters or scenes. And as I've mentioned, as storytellers, our ultimate job is to tell a story, a cohesive story, an understandable story, and if the reader is confused about the time passing, then it doesn't matter how good your story is because the reader was lost along the way. They didn't follow you all the way through the story because they were confused. I think that being meta about it, there ain't no shame about it. If you need to be meta, if you need to have like the chapters showing you the date, then it's fine. There is absolutely no shame in doing what you need to do to make sure that the story is cohesive and understandable. And if you need to start the following chapter with, the first snowfall of winter to let your reader know that, hey, by the way, we're no longer in autumn, then that's fine. Ultimately, what are we here for? To tell a story. Nothing else, nothing more. With that out of the way, there's one last thing I want to mention, and it's a very small and particular thing, and I don't want to leave it behind before I finish this video. This particular advice, like starting chapters with dates and such, and also using the narrative transition, I mean this advice mostly for big jumps in time. Like jumping between from month to month, and from season to season, or even years or decades. I would like something like that. I think that is the most effective. For stories in which the jump is a matter of hours or even days, I honestly feel that a simple page break, or a split in the narration, or a chapter break is actually even more effective, because, it's kind of like the internalized way of looking at things, It's kind of like cutting to a new scene on a movie, or, jumping over to another issue in a comic book. We assume that time is passing unless the writer tells us otherwise. So if you were watching this whole video and you were thinking, hey Max, You know, this advice for big transitions in school, like jumping from autumn to winter, but what about, like, you know, just jumping a day or two? Being entirely honest, just do a chapter break or a page break in the story, and I think you'll be fine. I think the reader will be able to understand based on what you're telling them. And of course, I'm not saying that you still can't use those things for, you know, smaller jumps. It's actually entirely fine and entirely okay. I think they still work. I just feel they're the most effective, like triply effective with giant jumps in narration. But, you know, again, do what you need to do. And I think that's kind of the theme of today's episode. Do what you need to do. Particularly in this case, to show your reader that time has passed. Again, as I've mentioned, you want the story to be clear so the reader can understand it and that there are no doubts or ambiguity, unless you want there to be ambiguity. But with all those things said though, I hope that today's video helped, and I hope that if anything, I gave you another point of view, my point of view on this particular issue. And as always, I want to thank you for watching. If you have questions of your own you would like to see answered on this channel, feel free to go down into the comments below and let me know. And if you would like even more writerly content, you can head over to my official writing blog over at maxkieran.tumblr.com. Thank you for watching, thank you for spending a little bit of your day with me, and I'll be seeing you soon! Mwah!